It's a lifeline that may have to continue for years. These refugees will not return home because they fear the Vietnamese, or they know there's even less food inside Kampuchea. Meanwhile, the West will do nothing to make Kampuchea a more attractive place for them to go home to. All development aid is denied as long as the Vietnamese remain in control. But the Vietnamese won't pull out their troops. They fear the Khmer Rouge would simply take over again. The border dilemma is deadlocked. In this stalemate, the Khmer Rouge are thriving, helped by their newfound friends in the West. They've spruced up their image. Pol Pot's men have entered into an unholy alliance with their rivals on the border, the two anti-communist groups. This so-called democratic government of Kampuchea gets Britain's vote in the United Nations. The Vietnamese-backed government in Kampuchea is cold-shouldered. But within this uneasy coalition, no one is doubting who calls the shots. The Khmer Rouge has twice as many soldiers as its coalition partners. Attacks like this on the Vietnamese are commonplace. Now this army that only 4 years ago was committing unspeakable atrocities is part of a government that has the official blessing of the United Nations. And this is the consequence of the West's support for that coalition government. The UN lorries, laden with food, arrive at this Khmer Rouge camp. Pol Pot's men have hit the jackpot. Millions of pounds worth of UN food and supplies is delivered to their doorstep. This remote jungle village is the headquarters of the Khmer Rouge. Access is strictly controlled. Few people are allowed in. Even doctors and UN officials have to get Khmer Rouge permission. And it is different from other border camps. The clothes and the faces of the women are Chinese in appearance. The men are clad in the green army uniform of Peking. Before we were allowed into the camp, it was sanitized. Soldiers with guns were kept out of sight. The atmosphere is sullen and disciplined. Foreigners are not made welcome. But the weekly food delivery, courtesy of the UN, is gladly accepted by the Khmer Rouge. The UN guidelines say that humanitarian relief should go to needy civilians, but at the Khmer Rouge camps, it's simply dumped on the Thai side of the muddy creek that marks the border. Khmer Rouge women carry it over the bridge into Kampuchea. What happens to it there is totally in the hands of the Khmer Rouge leadership. There's nothing to stop this humanitarian aid being used to feed Pol Pot's troops.
I think this is, in a way, obscene, that a regime which we condemned only a few years ago, we now continue to support in this way.
What are the consequences of Western food being given to the Khmer Rouge?
Well, the consequences are that the war which has been fought for so long inside Kampuchea, which has caused untold suffering for innocent people, is going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Why?
Because as long as we support a regime which we have described as being one of the vilest in human history, that regime is going to continue in power in the areas which it controls, and is going to continue fighting a guerrilla war and continue giving suffering to innocent people.
But the West are only giving the Khmer Rouge food, they're not giving them arms.
But a soldier needs food to fight on, and the food which we are giving is being used to support the soldiers.
Isn't it somewhat ironical that the Khmer Rouge, who were denounced as one of the vilest regimes of all time, are now flourishing on Western food aid?
Perhaps so, but you will have to ask the member states of the United Nations who voted in the General Assembly to provide this support to these people, including the Khmer Rouge, why they did it, whether they took that into account or not. We simply respond to directions that we are given by the member states of the UN, the majority of them.
But it is somewhat ironical.
You could say so.
Is that something that makes you feel uncomfortable, that you are the technicians, you are given this job to do, that the consequence of your actions is that the Khmer Rouge are flourishing?
Well, the reputation of the Khmer Rouge is well known. They claim in various fora that they have reformed what should we do if I were the international conscience? Should we say that these people should be exterminated because of their former role, or should we say give them another chance? It's not for me to predict how they will perform if they're able to regain or remain in a position of power.
But is there not a case not to give them food?
Well, perhaps, but this is up to the international conscience. I'm sorry to repeat this, but which finds its expression through the UN. The majority of the member states raise their hand and say this is the way we want to do it. And it's up to their politicians and governments to consider the consequences. And I think it would be rather inappropriate for me to give my own personal views on it.
9,000 miles from the border in New York, the United Nations voted 10 days ago to continue aid to the border. For the Khmer Rouge, it means another year of free food, courtesy of the West. For the innocent Kampucheans trapped on the border, surrounded by warring armies, it means life in no man's land will continue. After 14 years of suffering, their future is as bleak as their past.
Where the United Nations recognizes a government which does not exercise administrative control over the country and does not recognize a regime which does exercise control. It's an absolute basic contradiction.
This season's rice harvest looks like being the best in more than a decade, but that only brings Kampuchea back towards square one. Further development of agriculture is curtailed by the scale of calamity over the past decade. A 1970 population of 2 million draft animals has shrunk to 600,000 through war and neglect. This drop might have been remedied by the introduction of tractors, but we saw none during our visit. The United Nations donor countries, particularly the United States, Western Europe and Japan, have determined that Kampuchea shall get no development aid from United Nations organizations.
As to tractors, my first recollection of tractors was flying them into Tito in late 1944. I mean, the whole post-war European, Asia, China, USSR, tractors, tractors, tractors. And this time I was absolutely startled, given this dramatic reduction in animal power, and indeed in human power. The obvious thing is put in machines. And certainly the Kampucheans wanted, they were crying out for them. And we were simply told by the donors that would be regarded as development aid. An absolutely stupid decision.
Well, I think when we're talking about cutbacks in aid, that is that the UN agencies here are not able to do development work. For the people of the city, this means that vital projects like the power station and the waterworks, in particular, can't get support from UN agencies or the World Bank. And other less costly projects like the dredger to keep the Mekong River open so that even in the dry season the boats can come in with relief supplies or whatever. But if I can pick on the waterworks, that it might even be the most serious thing, because the supply is intermittent now, and pressure is very low. And nobody is able to help the waterworks except us, with a very small amount left in the original grant that Oxfam made. And when that's finished, I can't see how the water supply is going to be kept going.
Well, it's an entire frustration. With your left hand, you know the resources you can mobilize. With your right hand, you can see the needs after this tragedy, and yet you have those political contradictions, or almost there's an iron curtain in between them. Tragedy.
There are only 2 large factories still functioning in the entire country, and this jute factory in western Kampuchea is the larger of the 2. It employs nearly 300 people, and their peak production is 2,000 sacks a day. By the time the Khmer Rouge were overthrown, there was no jute being cultivated to provide the raw material. It took 2 years to get enough seeds to grow 500 tons of jute to start the factory producing again. These 2 men worked in the factory before the war, and even for a time, under the Khmer Rouge.
After Pol Pot's victory in April 1975, we continued to work in this factory. We were asked to train Pol Pot's people. But we had hardly begun to train them. They were still unqualified when they evacuated all of us from this factory, and we were sent to live in the countryside.
After our country was liberated on January the 7th, 1979, we returned to this factory. Everything looked so different. It looked like a jungle. There was grass and ivy growing all over. And as for the buildings, the storehouse, for example, had no roof and no walls. As for machinery, spare parts and other tools, some were broken, some dangling. Everything was scattered all over the place. At that time, those of us who were trying to reconstruct the economy began to collect everything that was left together, repairing the machinery gradually until we were able to produce some bags in order to serve the people and the state.
Most of the machinery was installed 20 years ago by the Belfast company of James Mackey. The Kampucheans restored it by cannibalizing what machinery remained, and then Oxfam paid for an engineer from James Mackey to spend 3 months here, helping to get the plant into running order. His visit and these sewing machines, also provided by Oxfam, are the extent of the outside world's assistance to this factory over 4 years. Without help being available from international organizations or individual governments except from the Soviet bloc, voluntary organizations such as Oxfam have had to fill the breach as best they can.
Well, the big difference between our role here and our role in other countries is that in other countries, Oxfam aid is only a tiny percentage of the aid which is provided. I mean, in India, say, our British government aid and United Nations aid provides well over 90%, and the non-governmental organizations like Oxfam provide a tiny percentage. Whereas here, it's the non-government Western agencies who are struggling with the enormous tasks that have to be handled without help from our governments.
In anything I say, I don't want to imply any political posture on the part of the Secretary General, whom I represent. We remain in this absolutely neutral. But if one could envisage a situation, as indeed I well knew for 20 or 25 years, where the government of Cambodia or Kampuchea in Phnom Penh was recognized by the United Nations, this would be an absolutely dramatic change for us, because that government would then have access to the entire international machinery, the United Nations Development Program, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. That, of course, does not exist at the moment. So it would be virtually a revolutionary change if that came about.
Like practically everything in Kampuchea, Phnom Penh's medical faculty had to start again from scratch in 1979, with what help they could get from various private aid organizations. The task they faced was formidable.
After our liberation in 1979, the National Solidarity and Salvation Front appealed to all qualified people to come back and serve in the Ministry of Health. At that time, as for doctors, there were 56 of them who responded. As for pharmacists, 26 of them showed up. And as for dentists, there were none left. There were only 28 students of dental surgery who were alive.
These medical students are working through duplicated copies of an out-of-date French textbook, but at least they are studying comparatively modern medicine. Under the Khmer Rouge, medicine was likely to be superstitious quackery. Dr. Seng Lom Nu and his colleagues had a nickname for Khmer Rouge medicine.
We called it rabbit shit. It was actually tree sap, sap of any trees that Pol Pot's people collected because they considered it to be medicine. The sap was then boiled and dried and rolled into small tablets. It was their cure for everything. Every village and district manufactured medicine this way. This medicine was given to people when they were sick, but we knew it was not medicine. We would throw it away in secret because we were afraid it could be poisonous.
For most people in Kampuchea now, their first contact with government-provided health care will be at a medical center like this one at Phuc district in Siem Reap province. It is supposed to handle the health needs of a community of 80,000 people. The 20 or so inpatients here are suffering from malaria, various fevers, typhoid and intestinal diseases. A doctor visits the clinic 2 or 3 times a month, but mostly the staff of 20 nurses and auxiliaries have to cope alone. There is no ambulance and no electricity, though in emergencies they have been able to borrow a generator. 2 years ago, the International Red Cross donated 100 blankets and mosquito nets plus some cutlery. That is all the outside help they have received, except a trickle of medicines and drugs channeled through the government. And these drugs, the private gift of the wife of a French diplomat who formerly lived in Kampuchea, which we had been asked to deliver.
This health center was started after the liberation in 1979, thanks to the effort of the people and the district committee, who have put a lot of hard work into setting it up. There are still many problems with the sick. The medicines that we have received from the province are not sufficient. We are short of medicine such as drugs for malaria. We have no medicine to deal with typhoid. And as for tuberculosis, we have practically no drugs at all for that. We depend a lot on the assistance of humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross. We still depend on them to help us to look after our people. We are still short of many things. I think the International Red Cross has given us the most. I do not know when they will stop giving aid. I have heard that their aid might stop, but I do not know when exactly.
The emotional scars of Kampucheans are not going to heal for many years. But outwardly, life appears to be getting back to normal, and the country is almost at peace for the first time in 13 years. After the traumas of the past decade, it is an anticlimax to witness a functioning city full of people leading apparently normal lives. But this normality, this stability, is under threat, and Kampucheans inside the country have a clear notion of where that threat comes from.
As a representative of thinking Kampucheans, I would like to appeal to the bunch of traitors living abroad to let us have peace and to leave us alone. They are already far away from us, and they should stay that way. They should not threaten our security. They should allow us to develop the country and educate our children so that they can support and protect the country later.
We support coalition, government, Vietnamese, out of Cambodia.
Outside the United Nations, émigré Kampucheans chant their support for Prince Sihanouk, while inside he addresses the General Assembly.
To accept the Vietnamese fait accompli in Cambodia would be to accept the law of the jungle. This law is already in force in many countries which tragically today are reduced to slavery by a great power.
The great power which Sihanouk is referring to is the Soviet Union, with their citizens seen here in strength at a friendly football match in Phnom Penh between a touring Moscow Dynamo team and the Kampuchean national side. Dynamo go further ahead, to the obvious delight of their fans. Their behavior elicits polite, mystified curiosity in the Kampucheans nearby in the main stand. Dynamo have already defeated Laos 3-0 and Vietnam 4-0. This game threatens to be an even bigger victory, but the Kampucheans are not without talent or bravery. "50 to 60,000 people have come to the National Stadium for this Sunday afternoon event. In a country starved of foreign contact, starved of relaxation, even a friendly football match conducted at reduced pace between unequal opponents must be a welcome break in the slow and painful grind of national reconstruction. The guest of honor, flanked by his Prime Minister and the Soviet Chargé d'Affaires, is President Heng Samrin. Also present are all the diplomats accredited to his regime. The Soviet Chargé was in a mood of guarded joviality.
You understand, it is not my position here to give commentaries on the Soviet position. But as you can see, as all men and women of goodwill can see, for the moment, the people of Kampuchea are asking not simply for some rice or some bread, but also for games. I underline that. Sports games, not military games.
In the closing minutes, the Kampucheans are awarded a free kick on the edge of the Dynamo penalty area. This being a friendly football match, they are able to make the most of it. The final score of 5-1 means that Kampuchea has the satisfaction of being the only team in the region to put a goal past Dynamo. It is not the presence of a few hundred Soviet aid workers and diplomats and their indulgence in routine public relations exercises like this that prevents international recognition for Kampuchea. It is the continuing presence of the far more numerous Vietnamese army that is the stumbling block. The Vietnamese do their best not to arouse Kampuchean hostility and are widely reported to be scrupulous in their behavior. This does not prevent their opponents from believing the worst.
They are Vietnamizing Cambodia. They want us to lose not only our independence, not only our territorial integrity, but our national identity. So I have no choice. I have to cooperate with the Khmer Rouge and with Son San to form a coalition, tripartite coalition, in order to do something against the Vietnamese, in order to persuade the Vietnamese to come to the conference table alongside us and to solve peacefully, in a friendly fashion, the problem of Cambodia.
People's Republic Foreign Minister Hun Sen explains in his prepared answer that far from fearing the Vietnamese, his government welcomes them.
It is true that the presence of Vietnamese forces in Kampuchea is necessary for us and will remain so as long as the threat of Chinese expansionism, US imperialism and other reactionary forces remain. We have made it clear that when this threat ceases, Vietnam will withdraw its forces. But the concrete realities of the past 4 years indicate that this threat will remain in the immediate future. Therefore, the presence of Vietnamese forces will continue as long as the threat from outside exists.
Opponents of